Good evening, everyone. I hope you're doing well. This is going to be a little bit more of a complicated video, but the short version is that the United States Federal Reserve is back to, quote, printing money, which is a crude term we use. They don't physically print money, they invent dollars in a computer, and they have complex methods by which they send those dollars out into the banking system. And of course, it gets expanded as banks make loans and create dollars. Most dollars are created by commercial banks. But I'll show you some of the simple ways first, and then we'll talk about some of the plumbing and why this is happening, why they're doing it now at a time when we have a massive inflation crisis, record high stock markets, unaffordable real estate, cost of living out of control. Government should be acting responsibly and raising interest rates and not printing money. But this is what's happening. So this is the Federal Reserve, their balance sheet. We're looking at their official website, and this goes back to 2008. In very crude terms, this essentially measures how much money the Federal Reserve has printed. And you can see in 2022, it's a little hard on this chart. They have some of the labeling very, very small. You see from 2008, the balance sheet was under 1 trillion, and it grew to nearly 9 trillion by the time we were done with all the COVID stimulus. And then, of course, in 2022, when they finally acknowledged that the inflation that they had created was a problem, they started raising interest rates and allowing bonds. When central banks print money, they buy government debt, which we call bonds or notes or bills or treasuries. Essentially, they're all IOUs, they're all debt. And what happens is to suppress inflation and to help interest rates go up, the Federal Reserve either sells bonds and or allows bonds that they hold to mature. They get paid back and they don't reinvest money. So they actually dropped the balance sheet from nearly 9 trillion down to about 6.5 trillion. So they took about 2.4 trillion dollars off the balance sheet. If we zoom in 6 months though, the balance sheet bottomed on the 2nd of December 2025 at 6.535 trillion, and it has now grown to 6.705 trillion. So it's grown by about 180 billion dollars. So in the last what's that? We're nearly 5 months into the year. So it's been a little bit longer than 5 months because it was early December. So in less than 6 months, the Federal Reserve has, quote, printed $180 billion at a time when we have a massive inflation problem. Inflation is above their acceptable target. Why we would want a government agency to deliberately create inflation has always just baffled my mind. Why I can't get people to understand this issue or to talk more about this issue. But anyway, let's talk about why they're doing that. So looking at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, their official website, and they're talking about the implementation of reserve management purchases to maintain ample reserves, which is a fancy way of saying that they're printing money because they're worried there's not enough cash in the system. And we just saw the growth of their reserve management purchases on the balance sheet. And if we scroll down, we can see that they've been doing RMP, reserve management purchases. The desk has conducted reserve management purchases at a monthly pace of $40 billion since mid-December. So they've continued to do that through 2026 thus far. We're at the 21st of April today. So they're essentially printing $40 billion a month, and the market or the Federal Reserve itself expects that they will do a total of $220 billion worth of this. Now let's have a look at something else. The reason for this, let's have a look. This is where it gets a little bit complicated. This is again the Federal Reserve official website. This is overnight reverse repurchase agreements. That's a bit of a tongue twister. You might have heard of the repo market or the reverse repo market. And you can see if we go back maximum, let me just load that. You can see apart from a few times through 2014 to 2018, again, when they were running massive money printing programs, it got up to 400 billion. But you can see this massive spike in 2022. It got up over $2.5 trillion, and now it's drawn back down to zero. So what is this? Essentially, this is excess cash that's out there in the system, in the banking system, that either banks or hedge funds or investment funds or corporations, like say if you're an Apple or a Google or a Microsoft and you've got, $30 billion cash, you can't just go and open a regular bank account like you and I do. You have to do something with that money, and that money typically goes into, money market funds. We'll have a look at the money market funds in a sec, but we'll start with this reverse repo because this is, again, people are arguing about, $5 billion here, or we got to cut $3 billion of spending from this program. Look at what central banks are doing behind the scenes. Trillions of dollars, thousands of billions of dollars slushing around. Why are you worried about all this surface level crap? that most of the politicians are talking about, and most of your political gurus online who don't understand money and that's not me saying I know everything. I only have a very basic understanding of money. Um, but so what's happening here with this reverse repo market is, I'm oversimplifying it, but during COVID, trillions and trillions of dollars were printed. The stimulus was handed out. We all understand that, at least at a basic level. There was too much cash in the system. That's a big reason why we had such high inflation post COVID. In Australia, inflation got up to 8.4% in 2022. I believe it hit 9.1% in the United States, as measured by the government's own doctored inflation, CPI, whatever numbers. CPI is different from inflation. They should really make that distinction. But essentially, what happens is that cash has to find a home. It doesn't just sit in imagination land. So the cash goes into some of it goes into money market funds. And you can see, sorry, this chart is very long term. Let's go 5 years. You can see in 2020 when COVID hit, money market funds, so essentially high interest cash funds that invest in short term debt, which is where if you have a high interest savings account in Australia, the same thing happens. I mean, how do you think the bank pays you a high rate of interest? They take that money and they loan it out at a high rate. So if you're getting 4%, they've got to find somewhere to loan it out at 4.1%. Generally, short-term government debt, so government bonds, which in the US they call T-bills. And you can see the amount of cash as of the end of 2025 has risen to nearly 8.2 trillion. Not quite a doubling, but not too far off. A massive increase, about a 3.6-ish trillion increase. So that money has to find a home. But if we have a look at the debt dashboard, so this is from, again, I'm looking at official websites. This is the United States Congress Joint Economic Committee, the debt dashboard. If we have a look at T-bills, so we can see what's on issue, we can see bills, 21.7% of US debt is in bills, roughly 6.82 trillion. But there is 8.2 trillion in money market funds. So that money had to go somewhere else. So what happens is the Federal Reserve, in order to soak up, at a time when they were, they're fighting inflation. Keep in mind, through 2022, 2023, remember, governments were telling us we're fighting inflation. We know inflation's a problem, so they have to raise interest rates. But that's what they tell you on the surface. Oh, we're raising interest rates. The plumbing and the mechanics behind the scene, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So one of the ways the Federal Reserve soaks up extra cash that's out there in the system, in the banking system, that might be used to, bid up assets into bubbles. And we have seen bubbles. I mean, the stock market's in a bubble. Crypto, we saw a crypto bubble, lots of other bubbles. I mean, even gold and silver had a little mini speculative bubble, early 2026, late 2025. So what happens is the Federal Reserve says to these institutions, whether it be the money market funds or a Vanguard or a BlackRock that has excess cash that they're managing for clients, they've sold out of the market, or they've got clients who want cash, interest returns, income returns. The Federal Reserve says, hey, give us that extra cash. Don't go out there because what would happen is, at a time when the Federal Reserve was trying to raise interest rates and stop inflation, if there's only 6.82 trillion of short-term US government debt out there that people can earn interest on without really risking the capital, I mean, there's always a tiny bit of risk, but as risk-free as you can get, what would happen is, at a time when the Federal Reserve is trying to increase interest rates, if there's 2 trillion extra of cash out there, or 2.5 trillion of extra cash, that money would flow into things like T-bills, and that would actually push down the interest rate. So despite what the media and the government tells you, the government sets the interest rate, but they don't control the interest rate. The market still controls it, and the government says, right, that's why they call it the cash target rate. The Federal Reserve would be targeting 3.75% as they are now. And if the market might say, if there's extra cash, the market might start buying these T-bills, pushing up the price of the T-bills effectively in the short term, pushing down the interest rate. Maybe the Federal Reserve wants interest rates at 3.75% because they believe that's an appropriate rate to fight inflation, but the market has excess cash, so they're buying T-bills at 3.6%, 3.5%, and that's working counter to the Fed wanting to raise interest rates, which they were wanting to do through 2022 and 2023. That's why this spike in this repo market occurred, because the Fed said, hey, that extra cash, we're raising interest rates. Don't go out there and buy T-bills and prevent short-term interest rates from going up, because we, the Fed, are targeting, I think they got up to 5.25% at the peak of the cycle in 2023. So they're saying, give us that extra cash, right? will hold it at the Federal Reserve as measured by this graph here, and then they swap. So it's a reverse repurchase agreement because a lot of these financial institutions are required to have collateral because money market funds have to be capital stable. So if there's $100 in there, it has to be either, it has to maintain that $100 value. There's no risk of capital to the client of the money market fund, the person putting the cash into the fund. So what happens is, as part of a legislative process that's too complicated for me to understand, the Federal Reserve says, hey, here you go, we've got some government bonds that we bought 2 or 3 years ago. You take these as collateral, you give us your cash, we'll pay you the interest rate that we've determined at the time based on where we think interest rates need to be. So that would probably be a higher rate than what T-bills would have been had they left the cash out there, would have pushed down the interest rate on T-bills. And so the institution gets paid interest by the Federal Reserve. And of course, the Federal Reserve just invents the dollars in their computer to pay the interest. And then, of course, once the inflation fight is over and the Federal Reserve can allow interest rates to go down again, we see this number starting to drift down. So I'm just going to take a quick pause there. Okay, so the market, according to Bloomberg, expects the Federal Reserve to, quote, print about $220 billion over the next 12 months. They're starting from December. So keep in mind, they're telling us that we've got this massive inflation problem. They're printing all this money. They're creating inflation deliberately while telling us inflation's a problem. Again, I've talked at length about how bad central banks are and why this is a bad idea. But let's have a look at this graph. And this is United States Treasury notes or bonds and the expiration date. Have a look at 2026. The yellow part is the interest payments, which, of course, like most governments, the US government is constantly borrowing money and accumulating debt, and they can't afford to pay the interest rates on their debt in many cases. So there's about 9 trillion, if you count the interest, the actual bonds, over $8 trillion of principal. If you add the interest, it's about $9 trillion that's going to expire in 2026, which means, the US government's taken out a loan for 5 years or 10 years by issuing a 5-year bond or a 10-year bond. And now it's time to pay that money back. And of course, how are they going to pay the money back? They're still borrowing $2.5 trillion a year on top of all the tax revenue that they collect. So this money is going to have to be reborrowed. So what's happening is they're starting to issue a lot more short-term debts. They're up to 6.82 trillion. But if you do a quick Google search, you'll find the US government is, because their debt is so large, they're issuing a lot of debt short-term. Because they don't want to lock in 4.5% rate for 20 or 30 years. I know 4.5% is low, but the amount of debt we have, the governments have around the world, and everyone has around the world, 4.5% is actually now a, quote, high interest rate for governments to even attempt to afford their interest payments. So as a result of the US government issuing more debt, having to reborrow. So this is just what expires in 2026. So 9 trillion, but they're going to borrow another 2.5 trillion roughly on top of that. So their borrowing needs for 2026 are probably going to be close to $12 trillion. 12,000 billion US dollars in 2026 is how much they borrow. So what's happening is now they're issuing all this short-term debt. They're issuing more T-bills. So 1-month loans, 2-month loans, 3-month, 6-month, up to a year, which a T-bill can go up to a year. And then, so all the cash is coming out of the reverse repo, and now it's going into the T-bills, as we can see evidenced by this chart. And so the Federal Reserve is concerned that, this is essentially the reverse repo is, so the money market, the 8.2 trillion, that's already in T-bills, or a small portion of it could be in, say, a 10-year bond that was issued in 2016 that expires in 3 to 6 months' time. It's now, even though it's a 10-year bond, it's been out there for 9+ years, so it now is acceptable for a money market to buy because there's very little risk of losing capital there. And the Federal Reserve is seeing this drain from the reverse repo facility of this excess cash. So remember, cash, that there was too much cash to buy all the T-bills and safe short-term debt out there. So it went into the reverse repo market, peaking at over 2.5 trillion in 2023. I can't get that graph to line up with that spike there, but it's roughly 2.4 trillion, sorry. And now the excess cash is being drained out of the Federal Reserve, out of their reverse repo facility. It's going into the T-bills, and now there's no extra cash there, and the Federal Reserve is getting out ahead of it. They're worried that there's going to be, a shortage of liquidity. And they're making sure that there's plenty of inflation in the system, that there's always plenty of cash to go around, while telling us at the same time that inflation's a problem. So I just wanted to highlight that and show you some of the plumbing that, we're in this massive inflation crisis, and governments and central banks, so they create inflation. Governments are going to continue to borrow unlimited amounts of money to give you all that quote free stuff that you keep voting for. Remember, nothing is more expensive than something the government gives you for free. And we're seeing them at a time when inflation is a massive problem. We're seeing them print money. And if we just have a quick look at trading economics, we'll have a look at the United States and their inflation rate, and they measure it many different ways, keeping in mind the Federal Reserve has a target of 2% inflation. So that would be, let's have a look at 3 years. So there's 3.1, 2.6%. At no point at any time over the last 5 years, that's the lowest number there. There was no number that month because of government shutdowns. At no point has the inflation rate on any monthly indicator been at their maximum acceptable level of 2%. And then it was, 9.1%. I remember that correctly. June 2022. This is the regular inflation rate. The Federal Reserve claims to look at the core PCE price index. So let's have a look at that. I just want to make sure I've got the core PCE one right. PCE, that's the price index. I want the actual inflation rate. And let's go to 5 years. We can see there's the 2% level. Can you see any month at all where the inflation rate hit the Federal Reserve's acceptable target? So inflation is too high, it's above target, massive cost of living problem, and they're worried about making sure. So all these, I guess, to wrap some of this up, for everyone who says, that the US government, no one's going to loan the US government money, they've got so much debt, the debt market is going to collapse. No, I don't believe that will happen. The Federal Reserve will invent. They're not even waiting for the debt market to run into liquidity problems. They're printing the money ahead of time to make sure that the US government can keep on accumulating debt, keep on borrowing, while telling us they're fighting inflation on the back end. It'd be like telling us that there's too many fires and they're going to go around and put out all the fires. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, they're sneaking around and lighting more fires and creating more fires everywhere. It's just, I hope that makes sense. If you've watched this far, I understand this was a very complicated video. I'll cut it off there. Thank you for listening. I hope it was informative. As you can see, the financial plumbing behind the scenes is extremely complicated, and be very careful, including listening to me, be very careful listening to a lot of these online gurus who don't understand even the basic level. This is just a basic look at the mechanics of what goes on behind the scenes. A lot of your favorite gurus who call for debt collapses, they don't understand this process at all. And especially a lot of these generic political commentators, who are calling for, oh, well, we've got money to fight the Iran war, so we've got money for the quote, free schools and the free Medicare. But no, America is accumulating, not just America, all first world nations are accumulating massive amounts of debt. Governments are going bankrupt. They cannot afford to pay for all these things they're paying for. And of course, the US government is already spending 24% of tax revenue, 24% of tax revenue, $1.227 trillion per year is going to pay the interest on their debt, not to pay any of the debt off, just to pay the interest. Thank you so much for listening. Cheers.